Curves in any design provide movement and interest. That principle applies to quilts as well. Yet when fabrics are cut and seamed to create curves, the process can be, well, frustrating, trying to get those opposing shapes to turn out smooth. To make the process enjoyable, I'll show you a carefree method of creating curves. This Drunkard's Path design is a quilt favorite. You'll learn how the curves are created effortlessly using a rather non-traditional technique. Quilt with carefree curves, that's what's next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. Amazing designs and Class A needles.
The traditional way of making a quarter circle block, as you saw in the Drunkard's Path design, is to have two shapes. And I've taped my fabric to my templates just so that you could see that they have two opposing curves. And these have to be seamed together. You pin them together, and when you do that, you will pin them at the ends and once in the middle, because it's hard to pin them together in this area. And usually, and always I should say, the outer curve seems longer than the inner curve. So to do the sewing for this with 1/4 of an inch seam allowances, you use kind of some fingerprint pins. First get started, and then pin with your fingers to get those edges to meet. And you have to kind of move that around, remove that center pin, and then go for the home stretch. And this is a very traditional way of making any of curve shapes. And I have to say, it works. It certainly works, and if you have templates like that at home, you can use them for these projects. But, you know, sometimes it's hard to get that shape exactly perfect, and I didn't do so bad. This is one I made yesterday, and I had a little problem giving a bowed area on the side. You press the seam allowances there, and you'd have the block. Another option the carefree option that I'm going to share with you is this has not been completely sewn, but you cut a complete square for the background. Fusible interfacing technique is used, and you get a smooth curve every time. This will later be applied into place. You can make it in many sizes. The template that I'm going to be using, you can make these 3 sizes from 4 to 6 to 8 inch blocks, and you use one template. In this program, we're going to use this template to make quarter circle blocks and whole circles. This is a 2-part series, and in the second program, we're going to make a very crazy name, Hearts and Gizzards block, very traditional block, but again, to get those curves, rather than sewing opposing curves together, we're going to use a template that will give 5 sizes. And then you could also make a fan shape or a circle shape or a wagon wheel shape, and this is called a fan shape, and you can make 5 different sizes with smoothness, a carefree technique, and that's what I'll be detailing now. The quarter circle block has so many options for design layout. You saw the Drunkard's Path, you'll see that again, but this is called Mohawk's Trail, and there's a 16 block section in the middle, and on each end I have 4 blocks. It's a tummy time quilt for little kids learning how to creep and crawl to be on the floor, and we will give you the instructions to make this specific design in the book that accompanies the program. And behind me is the same block in a very contemporary look. It's a block in process. It's going to be a dramatic wall hanging and made of the quarter circle blocks, and you can see there's one block and they're just flipped and flopped to have the motion. But to make these, I'm going to show you the details. You saw the interfacing in the sample earlier, but how do you get there? You can make it using the traditional templates. You're certainly welcome to do that, but if you'd like to make quarter circles, you can start by tracing a circle. And on this template, there are 3 different options for sizes. And on the side of the template that shows the quarter circle, you just read how you should cut squares, not circles. You're going to cut squares. You'll cut a 9-inch square for the circles, and for this particular block, it's 6.5-inch background fabric. I'm making a little smaller one for the sample. If you're wondering why such a big block, well, I'll show you in a minute, but also must mention that you, of the same size, cut fusible interfacing. And I have the smooth side facing the right side of the fabric, and then the fusible side to the underside. You place the template on the square, and you don't have to cut these perfectly square because we're going to trim this a little bit later, and then you trace in the die cut areas all the way around. Also trace the marks down the quarter areas because we're going to be cutting this apart, but we'll sew once, cut after the fact, and then mark all these areas as I mentioned. The 2 layers of fabric are going to be sewn together. It's a little light to see, but when I'm at the machine, you'll see that I'm going to stitch around the curves, the circle. Here I have my machine set at a 2.0 stitch, and I'm just stitching that continuous circle. And I've already done it on this sample. It's easier to see on the interfacing side. And from this side, I have marked, and there are little quarter marks on each corner because that makes it a lot easier to do the cutting. You're going to cut this apart in vertical and horizontal. One cut, and then this one I'll just cut separately, and then 2. And then some trimming takes place. Here's my quarter circle block, or portions of it, and then you could use a pinking shears or a decorative blade and trim around the edges so it's nicely graded. And then with the scissors, you're going to trim. Let me grab my scissors. We're going to trim, leaving about an inch, 1.5 inches on the inside. And you may want to save this for, never know when you might need this. Now, the interfacing is going to be pressed toward the underside, and use a bamboo creaser or a hair marker to make this curve nice and sharp, to bring that edge smooth to the outer area. And then do some pressing. And roll that with your fingers a little bit. And you can make these in mass. You know that you can just cut and press a whole slew of these quarter circles at once, and then you get a nice shape. The block was cut 6 inches, and I'll show you that block. And you're going to place it in one of the corners and pin it down, and then do some stitching. Now, all our blocks have been stitched with clear monofilament thread. And you put this in the top and a matching thread in the bobbin, and you stitch around the edge. Straight stitch, zigzag, blanket stitch. Here I'm using dark thread so that you can see the contrast. But just stitch around these edges, and you can stitch, as I mentioned, numerous blocks at one time. Clear thread is the magic element. No one can hardly see that stitching up close. So that's how you make these blocks, whether you make them small to large, using that template or the templates you have at home. It's really pretty easy with this technique. But then the layout, that's what gives you such creativity and so many options. And I have a different set of fabrics to show you how they're laid out. Now the Mohawk Trail is behind me, and it's made with one block, not different blocks. Sometimes I'll show you a little bit later that you need equal number with changing of the background and the quarter circle, but this is made all in one. And I'm just going to lay out 1/2 of this for you. And honestly, when I'm doing this, I have to look at a picture, but I think I can remember how to lay this out. So I'm going to start by placing the blocks with the squares to the center. And then I'll just peek around and just check out to make sure. Let me move this down a little bit. And then place the quarter circles so that you can see what we got going in here. And then I'll just continue to do the layout. And I'm doing half of it, and you can kind of get the idea. of how this is laid out if I did it correctly. I think so. And then this would be flipped around and I would just continue. And you can kind of see how the movement starts. This is all one color. But as we flip this up, the next design is called Fool's Puzzle. So this puzzle is made with two different color combinations. Perhaps you can see that we have the same block that I just worked with, but then the reverse, where the background becomes the quarter circle. So here are three of one design put together. So let me do that. 1, 2, 3. And then I'll move this and grab the opposite. Sneak a peek at what you have there so you can see, make sure that the design is correct. And I'm going to go like this. And this gives you 1/4 of this area. So this is one section that's laid out. The trickiest one is the Drunkard's Path, the most common quarter circle design that people like to make and see. I've made this once, I've made it twice, but to lay it out, I'm just going to show you that you need equal numbers. You need 8 blocks in this instance with the background of one color, and 8 blocks with the back, which was red here, is red in the quarter circle, so that it's flipped and flopped as it goes around the quilt, so that as the design, the Drunkard's Path name really comes to be. Now there are some very simple designs to create, and those are made with many times equal numbers of the blocks in opposing colors or opposite colors. So here we have made 4 blocks from one circle, pretty common, and then also 4 blocks from the other color. And I have them stacked here somewhere. Here we go. And we have 2 there and 2 there. So you can make a mill wheel, and simply by changing out the opposite corners. And pretty dramatic and fun. I mean, really fast. And you can see what fun that is just by doing that flip and flop. Now with this template, you get 3 different sizes of circles. You can put a smaller circle in the corners. And I did this on this sample. We're using batik fabrics in some of these very brilliant samples, and they really are dramatic. And by using 2 different sizes of quarter circles, you can place all one size together, but then notice the smaller circles that appear in the corners, because there's a lot of room. But then what if you flip this block? And that's what I'll show you next. You get a propeller type of look. The way that you can lay out these blocks makes it great fun. Notice here that you get movement again because you have 2 large and 2 small meeting together. And as you'd create the block, you'd have more movement and more propellers. So use your imagination when laying out a quarter circle block. Large or small circles in a quilt design can really make a statement. Use circles alone or combine them with geometric elements for a modern look. This single circle block variation, called Waxing and Waning Moon, was created again with the carefree fusible interfacing technique. You might guess that I have a quilt in process, and I haven't finished it, but I have some of the blocks that are going to be in a circle and geometric quilt design. Simple circle, but almost perfectly shaped. And then we have half circles, and then the waxing and waning of the moon is going to be incorporated in that quilt. Maybe someday you'll see it finished. Like the quarter circle, we're going to trace on squares of fabric and again use interfacing. And on this template, you can buy a circle template if you'd like, or use this one, or make a template out of a dinner plate. The choice is yours. But on this one, we can make 3 different sizes of circles, And it tells me for this very large one, and I'll just read it to you, but up here it says that you could cut a 14.5-inch background fabric, which is this big lavender square that I have. And then for the circles, it's 11.5 inches. Then add the interfacing. Cut fusible, lightweight fusible interfacing. I'm kind of combining the sewing and quilting world. Most quilters don't use fusible interfacing, but you can for this example or for this process. You place the template on your fabric, and I'll use a white marker and just trace around. Now we don't have to mark the quarters because we're not going to be cutting this into fourths as I did in the last segment. So meet the two fabrics together, set your machine for a shorter stitch length, and sew around the circle. Now on the underside, we're not going to, or I'll show you what I have here, and I'll flip this around so that you can see the stitching a little bit more. And I've started to trim away the outer edges. Again, pinking shears or a decorative blade on a rotary cutter. This is a 45mm rotary cutter. Just interchange the blades, and it nicely grades and trims the fabric. And then with your scissors, just do the rest of the trimming, leaving an inch, 1.5 inches. So you can see I've started to do this. So we're just in process. And then we're going to turn this to the inside, and I'm going to move over here because I have my iron right here. And you really do need an edge to keep that edge crisp, or to make the edge crisp. You can see I have a big circle. And use bamboo or a hair marker or an edge just to kind of form that before you do the pressing. And then you get the idea. Just form that edge, and it really gets very nice and even. Don't elongate your stitch when you're doing this stitching because you want it nice and tight so that it gives a nice tight curve. And I'm getting a facial as I'm doing my pressing, kind of 2 for 1 there, and you can see that nice edge that I've started to form. Now this circle has already been pressed, and I'm going to position it on the square, and to get it spot on, I've already folded the background 14.5-inch square in fourths and pressed the corners. Then I'll do the same for the circle. Fold it once, fold it twice, and then just give those corners a little press. And you can press that out after a while, but the main purpose of doing this is to center the quarter marks, or to align the quarter marks so that, here we go, I think it's got to come up a little bit, it gets nicely centered. And again, use that monofilament thread, that very clear thread, and top stitch or zigzag or blanket stitch around the edge, and you have a block, big, small, made in the same way. You can do some variations of the theme, or the seam, and this has, either you can have bias tape down the center, or actually I cut it apart right down the middle, and then cut a section of another color 1 inch wide. 1 inch is important because if you use 1/4 of an inch seam allowances, then it will exactly meet together. And I'll show you what I mean by my next example. We'll just stay right here. You can see what's going to happen. Make 2 fabrics, 2 circles, opposite fabrics, cut them in half. Make the waxing and waning moon block, and when I flip to the underside or the back, with 1/4 of an inch seam allowances, those raw edges will kiss together, and you'll see that you're not going to change the shape of the circle if you use that 1/4 of an inch seam. So half circles, waxing and waning of the moon, or a full circle, and you have great options for your next quilt project. The new buzz term in the world of fabric and thread is modern quilting. If you're wondering what modern quilting means and what type of quilt fits into that description, you're not alone. Please welcome Elisa Haight Carlton from the Modern Quilt Guild, who joins us via Skype. Elisa, good to see you via Skype.
Hi, Nancy. Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I had the honor of being at the first Modern Quilt Guild or conference in Austin, and I was blown away with the designs, and that's why I knew I had to have you as a guest on Sewing with Nancy and to tell others about what makes a modern quilt. So give us kind of a little summary of what's the category or what fits the description of a modern quilt.
Well, you know, modern quilting is really sort of a new aesthetic that has arisen, that has sort of developed, come out of a number of different things. Certain things that you see specifically in modern quilting, you see various traits repeatedly. You see lots of negative space, you see lots of use of solids, asymmetry, bold color choices. Sometimes you see a traditional quilt pattern that a new twist has been taken on.
Well, speaking of that, we can show a traditional pattern. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the best of show from QuiltCon was a traditional pattern, but it doesn't look traditional.
Exactly. Yeah, Double-Edged Love, beautiful, beautiful quilt made by Victoria Finley Wolfe. Really, if you take a look at it, you can see clearly it's a traditional double wedding ring pattern, but then really lots of different play with improvisational piecing and which parts of the piecing are the negative space. She really turned it into something new and interesting, really her own spin on that traditional pattern.
And I was able to see that quilt in person, and the back is as interesting as the front. Totally different look.
Yeah, really gorgeous.
Now, negative space, the importance of the background being important as the foreground is demonstrated in the deconstructed 9-patch quilt by Jackie Gehring.
Yeah, Jackie's such a talented artist. I mean, really, she repeatedly in her work, you see amazing use of negative space. And this is something in particular that I think you really find specifically with modern quilts, in that when the design when the quilter comes up with the design, they're looking at that. They're really considering how will I create a very graphic image with my design, and that negative space really shines through. Especially in that quilt is such a perfect example of it. I also think you rarely see borders used in modern quilting, and I think that really applies to the negative space as well. Because if you were to throw a border around that, it would take away from sort of the edge of that negative space. Yeah.
And the Log Pyramids quilt again doesn't have borders, bold colors.
Lots of bold colors. And, you know, I think that quilt's a great example of very precise piecing, very careful, precise quarter-inch seam allowance piecing, coming from what is a distinctly modern quilt. Yeah, you really see all different kinds of piecing and design choices that way in modern quilting.
And I have to say, when I went to the exhibit, I wasn't expecting, and excuse me for saying this, but workmanship to be so stellar, and it was top-notch. As traditional quilters, it was equally that way with the category of modern quilters. So it doesn't matter, it's just different design.
Exactly. Everyone cares about construction and workmanship, and that their quilt lasts over the years, especially because modern quilters really make functional quilts. So they have to stay together. You know, they're going to be thrown in the wash and in the dryer, and then, you know, they got to hold up.
A quilter is a quilter.
Exactly.
Now, you've made this quilt called Bias, Elisa.
Yes, yeah. I think that quilt is there's a lot of negative space in that one as well, but it's also a really good example of alternate grid work or non-block based design, where the design really develops by looking at the quilt as sort of one huge block rather than a number of small ones put together in a traditional grid. Yeah,
the bias flow is very appealing. There are hundreds of quilts that we could talk about, but I want people to be aware of Modern Quilters and the Modern Quilt Guild and the events that you have, and I thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
You're welcome. And you can find out more about the Modern Quilt Guild by going to All Things Sewing with Nancy, and you go to nancyzieman.com. We can rewatch this interview or rewatch this program on Carefree Curves, and then click on the link to the Modern Quilt Guild and find out more information where there may be a chapter in your area. Well, this wraps up our program, our first of the two-part series on Carefree Curves. Join us next time. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.
Nancy has designed a set of 3 templates and written a book that can be used to create the quilted projects featured in this program. The templates are $24.95 plus shipping and handling. Book is included free with purchase. To order this reference material as well as notions used during the series, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2714. Order item number BK2714, Quilt with Carefree Curves, templates, and free book. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at nancyzieman.com to see additional episodes, Nancy's blog, and more. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Class A Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Oliso. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.